questions and answers video part 2. More questions, more answers, and if you have more questions, remember you can go down into the comments and ask them down below for a future video, possibly answering your questions while making a project. Before anybody asks, this little badge, I'll put a link down to it. This is made by Mouse, a regular viewer. It's based on the supercomputers, but it was a little tiny wearable one. Very nice. I wear it during the live streams. He is making them and selling them on Etsy. It's very neat. First question. James Rafferty says, I have a 12-volt motor and a battery, 12-volt of course. I need to set the system up to use near water. What is the safest way to do this? And would I need a cut-off between the motor and the battery? The motor drives the propeller. Any ideas? Thanks, Clive. I would recommend an isolator, definitely some easy high-current isolator to protect the motor and suitable fusing protection. But waterproofing is the most important thing in shielding, deflecting water, because the biggest risk, the risk of shock at 12 volts is low, but the risk of electrolytic corrosion is huge when water gets into DC electrics, particularly if it's salty or dirty water. So those are the most significant factors. Mick, MOVMK, says, sorry to be the smash hits one, Clive, but I am genuinely curious. What kind of music are you into the most and what you're currently listening to? My preferred music is EDM, electronic dance music, just because of the era I grew up in, when the electronic revolution happened, and it was just such a new thing. But I don't have any particular favourites. I have a playlist on Big Clive Live of music, but it's just a random selection I put in there. I don't generally play music when I'm designing or working on stuff because I find it a bit distraction. When I'm doing bulk assembly of things, I'll often put music on the background, and it could be, say for instance, CFAX Crew, just one of their live acid mixes that they do, just because it's a continuously morphing thing being mixed live in their videos. But that's a good ambient background noise, and they last a long time because it is a continuous mix. David Kay says, not a technical question, but I recently heard a Scotsman try to say purple burglar alarm. And now I need to hear you and Ralphie try the same. Now, this was discussed recently in a live stream because because I'm Scottish, we have a guttural stop. So if I say that, it comes out as purple burglar alarm. And people might not, people think, oh, you just can't say purple burglar alarm. Purple burglar alarm. The reality is that if I went up to another Glaswegian and said, do you have a purple burglar alarm? They would know exactly what I was talking about just because, well, that's our accent. It does sound very odd. It is quite hard to say. Must of Us Fleas says, a mythical gentleman going by the moniker Mac Reynolds once stated, in any status-hungry culture, the level a man is assigned depends on what people think he is, not what he is. And that, of course, means that the only deliberately phony has real status. Most celebrities, the most popular ones, the most obnoxious and in-your-face ones. This is also why people try to dress in business suits to actually raise their visual status to make themselves look more important, and why the Pope wears a big, huge hat. It's all about show. And making yourself look important, that's true, it's how it works. My preference is I tend to judge people purely on their contribution to society, whether it's ability to write software or design stuff or run cables or fix cars or create wooden structures or build things. I tend to go, or cleaners or painters, all the trades and services that keep the world running. That's how I judge people. Casey Schmidt says, what is your guess prediction about the next implementation of LEDs in consumer products? For example, the LED neon coming about a few years ago. Where will it go next? I didn't really predict that LED neon. I was surprised. It's very nice. And it's really come down in price, and it's been refined. The design of it is refined. It's very hard to say where it's going to go next. I know where I'd like it to go next. I'd like it to go into fully serviceable lamps with swappable modules. The lighting industry is not going to go with that. They want the money. Dylan Dixon says, have you got any tricks or advice for sourcing rare or obsolete parts? Google and eBay. Particularly things like you'll find that, say for instance, obsolete chips are readily available, like the LM3909. You can go on eBay, you can buy one now. Quite expensive, but they were always expensive. That's a LED blinker that runs off 1.5 volts, by the way. But things like microcontrollers. The Russians cloned a load of like American and British microcontrollers, and they go under a different name, but there are comparison charts, and sometimes those Russian microcontrollers, which are still readily available, the microprocessors, they will just plug straight in place the existing processor, so you can find interesting stuff. The problem is that for really rare and obsolete parts, they become collectible, and that means the price goes through the roof. Robbo says, what are your thoughts on everything moving into microcontrollers and software? It helps make it easy for cottage industry maker types to put together products quickly, but ultimately reduces their maintainability in the future. I've seen so many things that have been rendered obsolete because a microcontroller got damaged. Say, for instance, some light controllers I used to work on, particularly Italian ones that used to flash over onto the 5-volt rail when something blew up because they didn't have proper protection. It would take out certain chips, the 5-volt rail. One of those was a microcontroller. You couldn't get the microcontroller because it was custom software, it was dead. Controller gets scrapped. Elevators and factory machines that have battery-backed PLCs, but they never actually put the program into sort of non-volatile memory, particularly in older units where it wasn't really terribly viable at that time. You can have a controller that there's a power cut, power comes back on, that's that machine obsolete because it lost the program, and the option in the PLCs is rewriting a program from scratch, which would mean completely reverse engineering the machine. Huge task. It would be like developing an entire product from scratch, not viable. But the other option is, replace the machine fundamentally. It's disappointing when that happens. One option there is to actually see if you can find an equivalent machine and get a software dump off that. But the worst thing that can happen there is you go to try and take a software dump off the other machine and it loses its program as well, and you've just destroyed someone else's machine. I don't like it when that stuff happens. But you see some stuff that it doesn't need a microcontroller, so people just say, well, I'm not using a microcontroller. That's good. Makes it serviceable. As Mike Page says in here. But he also says, what's the next layer up? The next layer is integrating, well, they've done it already, integrated the analog and digital, everything, and the Wi-Fi. Everything's done in a single chip now. It's pretty impressive. Wim says, can you describe inductance? Oh, can scientists describe inductance? I mean, you can go through that principle that current is flowing along a wire, it creates a magnetic field rotating in one direction and induces current flow in another wire. But in reality, they don't really know quite why it actually happens. But so from our perspective, you just break it down to the fact that if you have a coil of wire around a core, when you pass current, as it tries to magnetize that core, it will initially reach a sort of push back. It will limit the current going through because it's working to actually induce that magnetic field in where one didn't exist. And then likewise, when it's fully magnetized as far as it can go, it tends to let a lot more current through. So it's good for taking spikes out in filtering. But also then when you turn the power off, the magnetic field collapses and it induces voltage in the wire. It's interesting, but it is quite a difficult concept sometimes to get your head around, particularly the switch mode power supply transformers. Raphael says, purposely flame weary, and it was. There was a whole flaming section after this. In the US wall socket, should the outlet be oriented to have the ground pin located at the top, above the mains pins or at the bottom? Conflicting views. Some people say it's better to have the earth pin at the top in case something falls down, goes behind the plug, and could become live, hit a live pin, or jewellery could drape into it. But it's a controversial thing. I think I'd put the earth pin at the top, the ground pin at the top. And then I scroll down through all the arguments for above, for and against. OSHA apparently recommends ground up, but it never really made it to the NEC, so you've not got a standard for that. That's interesting. Andrew Donaldson says, which electronic magazine projects did you find the most satisfying to successfully build? Some that come to mind are the Direct Ion, which was a really compact ionizer that kind of like just blew electrical separation principles out the window, so it wasn't that great for spacing between tracks. but it fitted a 30 capacitor multiplier into a tiny little box. It was a really neat project. I bought some kits and it was fun to build. Another one I liked was the Jewel Thief was done, not as a project, just as a circuit example, and I gave it the name a couple of years later. In what year was that I gave it the name? Can't remember. 2002? I'm not sure. Or was it? No, I'm not sure if it was in the 90s. Can't remember. But another project I really liked was the EnviroSynth, which was a no microcontroller, just purely oscillators and linear feedback shift registers to create white noise, to influence a randomizer, whether something was rising or falling, and create white noise like wind and rain. And you could tweak, and it made sort of sounds like storms and rain, but you could hack it. You could bridge resistors in, and you could get real whipping, howling wind effects out of it. It was very nice. It was fun to play with. Eric Carlson says, I've heard you mention lockpicking in the past, specifically lockpicking lyre. Have you gotten into the hobby much at all, or just experimenting? To me, it's just a novelty. I've not really got into it to the same level as the lock-picking lawyer, who is so into it that, he's concentrating, clicking. He knows what's inside that lock and intuitively, and he's just clicking and picking and tweaking those little pins up and feeling when they latch. I'm not that far into it, but yeah, you don't have to be for many locks. It's novel. It's quite fun to pick a lock, particularly the stuff that's available on eBay. Raphael says, how about any discussion embedded projects? Anything Arduino-ish? I do have Arduinos, quite a few Arduinos, but they're novel, but I've never really found a project to use them. I tend to revert back to microcontrollers, like PIC microcontrollers programmed in assembly code, because for me, it's often easier just to use my library of routines that I've already written. Actually, if I really got into it, it's like the 3D printing, I would get into Arduino and click with it, but I've just not clicked with it. I've never really had the patience to sit down and basically start from scratch with Arduino. It's something that's a good thing. If you're getting into computers the first time, Arduino would be excellent because you'd be starting fresh and you'd be learning from scratch. Steve Pritchard says, I've repaired a football subs board and replaced two 6-volt lead acid batteries. The charger was lost, but a 12-volt supply fit the socket and seemed to do the trick. But I was wondering why it was like that. Two 6-volt batteries in series would actually need more than 12 volts to charge them. It would require 13.8 volts. Out of the box, both batteries were measuring at around 6.2 volts across the terminals with a multimeter. I wasn't sure whether I was getting a higher reading than expect because there's no load, or whether it would really need more than 40 volts to charge properly. Technically speaking, you're not going to get the full capacity of those batteries if you just charge at 12 volts. It will put a charge in, but not a lot. It'd be better getting a proper plug-in with the same little jack plug, a proper 13.8 volt sealed lead acid battery charger. They're very common, and they'll have the system that they'll do a bulk charge to a certain voltage level, and then they'll do a trickle charge up to when they reach 13.8 volts. And they change the charge level and then do a maintenance charge, and they will give you the longest runtime from those batteries. Dave Davies says, I've had a few tingles off high voltages during my career. Do you think that having experienced a few shocks makes you more resistant to them? I had a colleague in a repair lab about 40 years ago who seemed almost immune and would grab live wires for fun. I could grab a live wire now and not get a shock. I could grab a live wire and an earth wire. I would get a terrible shock. The first shock is without doubt. If you get a strong shock when you're young, and it's your first shock, it's traumatic. It's something that you've never experienced before, that sudden whoosh of energy through your body, as the electrons should go backwards and forwards in your body. You cannot become immune to electric shocks, but as you work in the electrical industry, you get little tingles from time to time, you get less worried about them, but you shouldn't get complacent with electricity. As I say, you can't get immune. People who claim, they're immune to electric shocks because they get so many, they work live all the time, they're probably working indoors getting slight tingles because there's no good return path. If they work outdoors in a wet environment and they've got wet hands and they touch a live connection, they're going to get a very harsh lesson. But certainly, with time and experience, you get less alarmed about getting an electric shock. You're more likely to laugh it off than be panicking and flustering. Robert says, what's your favourite tool for measuring? Well, first of all, it's the multimeter is really good. But he says capacitance, resistance, or even length and girth. Okay. Capacitance resistance. The multimeter, obviously, any multimeter, but as long as it's got my favourite two ranges, continuity and diode, which is one range for just beeping things out and tracing things and checking diodes or what's inside particular packages, and the 20 volt DC range. They are by far the ones I use the most. Other measuring device, the digital calipers are fantastic. I use them all the time, particularly for the 3D printing. I keep a set through here and I keep a set through next to the 3D printer. It's just useful to have them in different rooms. They're cheap and they're accurate-ish. I have to be careful what I say there. Excuse me one moment. I have to be careful what I say about accuracy because I've described them as precision in a video, the cheap plastic ones from China, and the machinists were not pleased. A little swig of coffee. Judith D'Souza says, how would you solder terminals onto a piezo? And is there such a thing as a conductive epoxy glue? Yes, you get conductive glues. They're not designed for high currents, but for signal connections, they're not too bad. The paints and glues, they're quite expensive. You get a tiny amount. They're usually silver loaded, which is what makes them conductive. However, you can solder with onto piezo. I've done it, but it requires a bit of technique. It's very easy to damage it, not just damaging the crystal in that area by making it lose its piezo crystal quality, but also the metallization of the surface can actually well away from where you actually put the solder blob. It's a kind of technique with ordinary solder. It's very much a quick dab it on, so just the tiniest amount of heat, and then tin a wire, place the wire on it and then just dab again just to stick it on to the solder. Not very professional, but that's how I usually do it. But also you can use a lower temperature solder if needs be. I think that's what they do commercially. R. Teisland says, is there a safe, proper way to build a protection circuit for devices that tend to blow the fuse on power on? I have an old laser printer that tends to blow the fuse about 50% of the times it's turned on. That's not normal. I assume it's lacking or has an inadequate inrush current limiter. I don't want to open it up and modify it, so an external inrush protection unit would have been nice. Would such device even make sense? First thing to do, try and look on the case for the fuse rating and type. It's really important because, say for instance, if it was a 5 amp, you get T 5 amp time delay designed to handle a slight inrush current, and you get F 5 amp, which is pretty much quick blow, instant blow. If you use the wrong one, if there's a transformer or some other load that has a high inrush current, if you use the quick blow fuse, it will usually just blow it. It needs that slight time delay in the fuse. Also make sure you're using the correct fuse value. If you can't find that information on the unit, on the label, the data label, check online for a manual for it. But there is another way for devices that are causing nuisance tripping. I've done this for friends with big building site transformers that when they plug them in to the wall sockets, they trip the Type P breakers. Normally, for inductive loads, you'd want a Type C breaker in the UK. But what you can do is you can put a bit of ceramic terminal block inside, and you can put 1 or 2 NTC inrush limiters, which look like NTCs. Black or green, but they look roughly like this, a little disc thermistor. And what it does, you get different ratings. They tend to be measured by their diameter and the start resistance or the hot resistance. But they start off with a slightly higher resistance, and as they heat up, that limits the inrush current. As they heat up, the resistance drops down so they don't dissipate too much, and they reach an equilibrium point. James Margerson says, have you seen the evolution of the LED neon? I've seen it evolving the standard, either the single-sided or the double-sided type, but he said, I've seen it's being sold in AliExpress and it now comes with different shaped light guides for directional light output. I've not really seen anything like that comes to mind. That's interesting. I'll have to keep an eye out for that. But I like LED neon. I know it's not real neon, but in many applications like theatre signage or signage that's going to get vandalized or bumped about, it makes more sense than glass neon. But glass neon is better suited to some other applications where you want longevity and real neon style. Andrew Donaldson says, which tools do you find you have doubled up on the purchase of? Side cutters and screwdrivers, most things, to be honest. If you have a favourite tool, I tend to buy a couple of each or more. Say, for instance, the little Poundland screwdrivers. I'll have a couple dotted about here, there, and everywhere. Sometimes a pair with the flat blade and the crosshead, so I don't have to even swap the tips. But also the side cutters, the standard cheap side cutters from eBay that are shipped from China. Buy lots, because you will break the blades by cutting things you shouldn't have cut with them. And it's always good to have some fresh, sharp ones. El Beret says, it made me smile when you got so excited as you realised the Potato Vision in the last stream would be a good title, background, thumbnail. I appreciate the difficulty continuing up with new backgrounds. It is, for the live streams, it's quite tricky coming up with the thumbnails, but you know, I'm getting alright with that. He also asks, he's asked loads of questions. I'll just answer a couple, because when asking questions down below, don't stack hundreds end to end. Just ask one per input, so to speak, one per comment. Otherwise, it gets a bit hard to track them. Do you have a favourite windsock or enclosure for outdoor microphones that may be subject to strong wind, blow and rain? I have a little microphone here. I can't really bring it down much. It's got a little foam cover over it, but I don't really film outdoors. If I did, I'd have to get the proper muffler, but I don't really film outdoors much. Oh, when using thermal cameras, do you have any particular technique for avoiding erroneous readings from shiny surfaces? Yeah, you just have to get used to it. When you get a thermal camera, you have to realise that sometimes that hot spot in the circuit board is a shiny solder joint reflecting something hot, maybe even your body. So you have to understand that when you're looking at things, and also realise that looking at a soldering iron or a shiny metal thing that's hot, you get a weird reading of it. It doesn't seem right, because it's the transmissivity, no, that's wrong, transmissiveness, of the surface is important. They're calibrated on matte black surfaces, and you can put a bit of Kapton tape onto a surface if it's shiny to get a better reading. You have to just get used to it. Using a thermal imaging camera involves getting used to how they work. C-Dyke Mike says, some electronics YouTubers use measuring equipment with 5 or more decimals. Seems like you can't get too many digits. I would classify those as the geeks and collectors. I know that Dave really likes his like multi-digit displays. For me, the only resolution I need is to 1/100th of a volt, purely for the lithium cells. For everything else, like it would have been to 1/10th of a volt, is ample. There are so many questions. I'm thinking now, actually, I may have to go on to a third video here, because there are so many questions. Right, tell you what, because this has hit the 20-minute mark again, it's past the 20-minute mark, I'm going to stop, and there's going to be a third questions and answers video, just to actually make it into more manageable portions. So that is the end of this one. Remember, you can leave more questions down below in the comments.